discuss the campaign to fix the debt, a nonpartisan movement to put America on a better fiscal and economic path. I want to thank Zach Lingley. Where is Zach? Here's Zach. Thanks Zach, who's the Maine field coordinator for the Fix the Debt campaign, and most notably graduate of the University of Maine School of Law. We're very honored to welcome the two co-chairs of the Maine chapter of the campaign to fix the debt, former Governor John Baldacci and former State Senate President Richard Bennett. Richard Bennett served as the president and CEO of the corporate library from 2006 to 2010, and it merged to form GMI Ratings in 2010. He has extensive background in politics and government and private sector. He's been a director of corporate governance for Lens Investment Management before that. On the government side, he is the former president of the Maine State Senate. He served 4 terms in the Maine State Senate and also 2 terms in the state's House of Representatives. And we're delighted that Richard Bennett is here with us today. Governor Baldacci was first elected to public office many years ago. As a young member of the Bangor City Council, he was elected to the Maine State Senate in 1982 and served as a state senator for a dozen years. After that, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Maine's 2nd District, where he served for 4 terms before coming back home and being elected as Maine's 73rd governor. He served 2 terms as governor from 2003 to 2011. More recently, he's worked in the federal government, in the Department of Defense, working on the Military Health Care Reform Initiative, and now as a senior advisor for economic development and government relations at Pierce Adler. We're a law firm downtown. We're very, very honored to welcome our guest, and let you take it away.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Peter. I really appreciate coming back to the University of Maine Law School and presenting. Last time I was here was on the very arcane and somewhat dry subject of corporate governance, which is, about how corporations govern themselves and how boards of directors relate to shareholders. So I'm glad to be back to talk about something which is tremendously relevant, I think, for all of you. It's certainly in this room. And I just want to say thank you for coming, because this is a tremendously important issue. I just also want to say we're few in numbers, so please be informal here. There's pizza over there. I would feel better if I knew you were nourished, so please get up while we're speaking and go help yourself to the pizza. I think there's basically 1 pizza for each person in the room, so don't feel shy. I've come to this campaign to fix the debt naturally. First as a father of 2 teenage kids. Second as a businessman overseeing a global firm which happens to have its center of gravity here in Maine with about 40 people. And third, as Peter mentioned, as a recovering politician who only occasionally falls off the wagon. I believe we are at a point of urgency in our country's history. And it's a critical point demanding the better angels of our nature and requiring coherent leadership from all of you, every person in this room. History and human nature has shown that leadership on this issue of our debt will not originate in Washington. It's got to come from you. I'm very pleased to be working with Governor Baldacci on this initiative because with regard to the national debt, the stakes are simply too high for this conversation to be lost in the muddle and mud of partisan politics. Our elected officials in Washington, and they're good people, the folks from Maine. I know them all and have worked with them across the spectrum. They must be empowered and enabled by us to end the culture of careerism and consider the long-term damage that continued fiscal mismanagement is doing to our country. Now, Governor Baldacci and I were once political opponents. Peter was too polite to mention that in that 1994 race where Governor Baldacci was first elected to the United States Congress, I was his opponent, and he shellacked me. So
it's pretty close.
It was close enough, right? But it was a good election, and you know, my hope, and I think Governor Baldacci shares this, is if people see two old, middle-aged political rivals put away their partisan swords for our kids' future, then the gravity of the situation might be a bit clearer for our congressional delegation, and that we as Mainers, regardless of political affiliation, can come together and say to our elected officials, this must stop now. We must find a solution now to our debt. Now I've got a few slides. I'll run through and then I'll turn it over to Governor Baldacci. And forgive me for some of this is going to be very difficult to read, but I think you get the picture. Because the pictures say more than the words. Our current national debt, as accounted for on our national balance sheet, is $16+ trillion. It's important to realize how staggering this number is and how quickly it has come about. Debt has existed, of course, since the dawn of our republic. In fact, there was only one year in the history of our nation where we had no debt. Any idea what that might be? What year that was? You won't remember. It was 1835. But it took the first 200 years of our republic to reach $1 trillion in debt. And in just the past 30 years, that $1 trillion has doubled, then it's doubled, and then it's doubled again, and yes, it's doubled yet again. I can think of no other institution, aside from the United States Congress, where this type of behavior could be tolerated. Such reckless behavior in the private sector, in the corporate boardroom, or at the kitchen table is simply inconceivable. As this slide shows, even as related to the size of our economy, and this is relative, this slide shows our debt relative to the size, the output of our economy. Our national debt is on a trajectory to overwhelm everything else we hold dear by the time that my teenage son gets to be my age. 2050 is just not that far away. Here's a slide of revenue and spending. And as these pie charts show, the math is pretty straightforward. We are spending more than we're taking in. And we're doing this at an increasingly alarming rate. If you look at these charts closely, one thing that becomes obvious is that after all of the mandatory spending, the so-called entitlement programs, and the interest on the debt, just take the entitlement programs and the interest on the debt, there is actually no revenue, none, zero, left over to fund what most of us think of as government. The Department of Transportation, the parks, the monuments, FEMA, the State Department, agriculture, or even our armed forces. All the money we spend for ordinary government operations, including providing for the common defense, is borrowed money. Entitlements and interest payment consume it all, and it is going to get worse. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and other entitlements blow the lid off our national debt, our national budget, and our economy. And absent decisive action will get alarmingly worse throughout the coming decades. One of the big problems as you borrow more money is, of course, interest. If you think the entitlement growth is alarming, look at the effect of our spending beyond our means on our interest payments. At our current pace of spending, by 2080, interest payments alone will exceed 40% of the entire United States economic output per year. Much sooner, again, by the time my teenage son is my age, at our current pace, total spending will be 44% of our economy, almost double the 24% of today. And interest payments will exceed one-third of federal spending. At the same time, when my father came of age, there were 16 workers for every Social Security retiree. Now, there are just 3 to 1. In 20 years, there will be just 2 people working for every person retired on Social Security if we do nothing. There are other problems as well, stemming mainly from the animal instincts of Congress to give away money that not only they don't have, but frankly, nobody has. Much of this is done through instruments called tax expenditures. These include corporate welfare payments to big agribusiness and energy businesses. Grover Norquist says that if you get rid of these handouts to corporations, you are guilty of raising taxes. And if you're a Republican, he will destroy your re-election chances. If there was ever a policy initiative that we can all agree on, I think a simpler tax code would have to be in the conversation. The sad truth is that we've driven ourselves, our economy, and our kids' futures into a corner. We cannot cut, we cannot tax, and we cannot grow our way out of this corner. There is no one solution, no silver bullet that can accommodate the magnitude of this crisis. We need a comprehensive solution that does all of these pieces to build a sustainable future. Now, how to reduce the deficit? Well, first we need to put a clamp on the pig. And of course, we'll all be able to hear the squealing of 5,000 lobbyists. But all of these items need to be pursued. Now, the campaign to fix the debt was born out of the Simpson-Bowles plan, which you may have heard of, the results of which were rejected initially by President Obama. In election year, of course, everyone was able to find something wrong with the Simpson-Bowles plan. And although by no means do I think this would have represented a perfect solution, none of us thinks it's a perfect solution, Congress's resolve to do nothing is undoubtedly the worst case scenario. However, in my view, our situation is not hopeless. There's many smart people in and out of Congress are piecing together solutions that I believe could represent a collective solution if our elected officials will roll up their sleeves and do the job we elected them to do. Now, to get this done, though, in my view, requires more than just reform of taxing and spending in our entitlement programs. I believe that beyond the fiscal solutions, we need to change the culture of Washington. That demands structural reforms in the way Congress operates. The time has come for the federal government to stop choosing winners and losers. The sad truth is that as crony capitalism and corporate welfare run rampant in our nation's capital, it's middle-class families and small businesses that suffer. People have lost their faith in the institutions, both in the public and private sector, that they used to cherish. And we need to correct that erosion as well. Here are a few ideas I favor to create a new culture of responsibility in Washington. First of all, earmark reform. The political gamesmanship that occurs in the process of passing vital legislation, as we saw just recently with the Hurricane Sandy relief package, is really unconscionable. Did you know that in the $50 billion plus Sandy relief bill that was passed by Congress, there was $150 million tucked away in there for Alaskan fisheries. There was $41 million for 8 military bases across the country, and there was $4 million for Florida's Kennedy Space Center. We need to deal with earmark. Non-germane amendments. One thing in the Maine State Senate, Maine Legislature, is you can't tack amendments onto bills that aren't related to the bill type. We need a new rule in Congress to do the same thing. I also believe personally in no budget, no pay. According to a poll last month, Congress started 2013 with an approval rating of about 14%. It's no secret the American public is fed up with the U.S. Congress. Representative Jim Cooper in Tennessee has been pushing a bill that would withhold pay from members of Congress if they fail to pass a multi-year budget on time. This idea is actually gaining traction in Congress. And there was a version of that which was passed when they kicked the can down to March 1st for the new fiscal cliff. Personally, Alec, forgive me, but I think we should extend that and go to congressional staffers as well. If Congress can't get the job done, not only should they not get paid, but their staff should be paid. Finally, I support a balanced budget amendment. We elect people to Congress in even-numbered years and entrust them to make difficult decisions that will ensure the future prosperity and enrich the lives of future generations. Unfortunately, the partisanship and careerism have created an environment in Washington where our elected officials just don't have the fortitude to make the tough choices. And it was at the close of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Benjamin Franklin was interrupted as he left Independence Hall in Philadelphia on the final day of deliberations. A woman came up to him and said, "Dr. Franklin, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." We must take the steps now to ensure the existence of our republic. And that includes protecting Congress from itself. And I believe the balanced budget amendment is part of that mix. I'm happy that Senator Collins is supporting the balanced budget amendment as a longtime supporter, and that Senator King, who used to be opposed to the idea, has come around as well. But whatever solutions you favor, please make your voice heard on this critical issue of our debt now. If you're motivated, I encourage you to please go to the Fix the Debt website, read more. There's some sheets in front of you to sign up for the Can Kicks Back, which I love, because frankly, it's your generation, that of you in the audience, that is really going to have to pay the price on this. It's my kids, it's all of you. And we can't afford to kick the can down the road anymore. With that, I want to thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to turn it over to my colleague, Governor Baldacci, and then we can make a presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, let me just say how much I appreciate being able to work with you on this issue, and having had the unfortunate situation where we had to run against each other ultimately after going through crowded primaries. It's much better now than it was back then. I still remember some of those campaign ads, which I'm sure you probably remember too. And you know what they say on television is interesting and challenging, but it gets more challenging the closer you get to elections. But it was interesting. And speaking of Congress, first, Peter, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. Wonderful school facilities and all of you. And I'll try to be brief. I think Rick has done a nice job of laying out the issues and telling you the different problems and challenges that we face. Ultimately, if we don't do this, our economy is going to hurt tremendously. And what we are concerned about is jobs and economic development and growth, and this is directly tied to it. Our federal budget, $600 billion a year in interest payments, swallows up most other spending, as Rick has talked about. They've actually moved the USS Harry Truman out of the Middle East waters back home to save $700 million. You're going to see a lot more of this discussion with the sequestration issue, which Congress, I understand, is going to let go through. So there's going to be cuts across the board in a whole wide array of areas, and I hope it doesn't affect student loans, but I'm not certain about that. I have a son who's a senior at the University of Maine and would like to continue on for a few more years. So, I think, it's important that some of those things are watched, but across the board, we're going to look at cuts and reductions and slowing the rate of spending. And the reason why that's such a big issue is because if there is no private capital room to borrow money, the interest rates for car loans and home loans and business loans is going to be higher. And when that happens, businesses and individuals and homeowners don't purchase as much, don't buy as much, which will have a tremendous negative impact on our economy. We had gone through this as a country when I was in Congress in the 90s, when President Clinton worked with Speaker Gingrich to balance the budget and create a stability in the marketplace. I now work at a law firm where there's a lot of large corporations that are represented by the law firm. And without an exception, you hear from those businesses saying basically that they're not ready to invest, they're not ready to put their capital into the market because they're unsure of what they're looking at for the terrain in terms of taxes, in terms of programs and initiatives, and there's no settlement to it. So you have a lot of private capital sitting on the sidelines. So if we want to get our economy going, and we want to make sure that their reasonable rates and interest is at a point where people can afford it, then we've got to get a long-term plan passed. And the hard part about a long-term plan is that it affects everybody. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and a lot of the education and defense spending. But if we don't do it, we're going to get gobbled up by interest payments. And I worked at the Department of Defense for a year working on military health care reform. And I can tell you, health care is a huge issue to everyone. 40 cents of every federal dollar is health care. So unless we figure out how to get healthcare to be more affordable and making sure it's more universal and that people have participation in the healthcare market, we're going to have this problem continuing to chase our economy. So the sum and substance of it is to basically point out to you the severity of the situation, how it directly impacts you in your potential in terms of the economy and job prospects, and at the same time how it impacts our future generations. I believe, as Admiral Mullen, who is just a terrific individual who I work with on Total Force Fitness, said that, you know, this is not just an economic problem, an economic security problem, it's a national security problem. Because if the United States of America isn't strong, and isn't strong in a military sense, a defense sense, then I think there's going to be risks around the world that will grow exponentially. So I think this is something we've got to work at, we've got to do it together. I mean, and we joke about it, but it was a pretty hard-fought race. And I wanted to work with Senate President because I figured if I could work and demonstrate to people that we could work across the aisles, that this would be a message in a small, Maine way about how we work together in our state regardless of party. We have independents, Democrats, and Republicans working together because they put the common good above their own good. And I think this is one where politically, sure, there are issues, and there'll be many groups attacking people who are supporting different aspects of the plan. But you know, in terms of looking at the overall national economy and the country's national, international interest, I think that history will determine, you know, whether we made the right step or not. I think momentarily, sure, there are going to be critics that are out there that will pick, as Rick had said, about different aspects of the plan. But I think if you make it a shared sacrifice, it's across the board, it's showing that everybody is pulling in just to make sure that we can provide for the longer term sense of our country, then I think it'll be worth the effort. I don't want to go on too much longer because I really do want to hear from you and try to be able to be helpful to answer questions. But before we start in, I guess we've got a presentation. We have a young man here from Senator Collins' office.
We do. As I indicated, we've had really great feedback from the congressional delegation. In particular, Senator Collins has been for a long time now, been a voice for fiscal responsibility. And I'm very happy that Alex Fortress of her staff has come here today to receive from us a letter which has been signed by about 115, I think, people at recent Basic Issues from the Portland Regional Chamber of Commerce that Governor Baldacci and I spoke to. And these folks, I won't read you the letter because you've already heard the message, but it will show it to you. And this is just the first page of signatures from people all across the greater Portland business community who signed this letter and wanted this communicated to this congressional delegation. And it's, I really appreciate Senator Collins making you available to come to us and receive this letter at this venue. And I want to thank her for her leadership on this terribly important issue for our country. So thank you, Al.
Thank you very much, Senator Bennett. Thank you very much, Governor Baldacci. You all have just a moment. I'd like to read a statement from Senator Collins. We just set this down here. Fixing the debt is an issue that obviously affects the country deeply, and something Senator Collins has focused on throughout her career. She just asked me to read a brief statement today. She was sorry she couldn't be here in person. But she says, thank you very much, Governor Baldacci and Senator Bennett, for serving as co-chairs of the Maine chapter of the Campaign to Fix the Debt, and for advancing the public conversation toward bipartisan solutions to address our long-term budget challenges. Little is more important to our country than this issue, and the failure to find solutions is irresponsible and ultimately perilous. It took the U.S. government 191 years, from 1791 until 1982, to run up its first $1 trillion in debt. But each of the last 4 years alone, we have seen deficits that exceeded $1 trillion. Our national debt now tops $16.5 trillion and has become a drag on our economy and a threat to our prosperity. The challenge we face will only grow as the baby boomers retire, putting greater pressure on mandatory spending for Social Security, Medicare, and other programs. We've dug ourselves into a deep hole. Now, for our sake, for the sake of our nation's future, we we must stop leaning and begin to climb out. Doing so will require a combination of spending restraint and policies that foster economic growth. Only by working together can we find the solutions needed to deliver common sense, competent government that is worthy of the people of Maine and the United States. For my part, I have long been convinced that a balanced budget amendment is needed to address our growing debt and deficits to force Washington to permanently align both sides of the federal ledger. I am pleased to be an original co-sponsor of the most recent balanced budget amendment proposal, which we introduced in the Senate last week, and I only wish that the balanced budget amendment had passed when I first voted for it in 1997, my first year as a senator. The co-founders of the Campaign to Fix the Debt, Erskine Bowles and former Senator Alan Simpson, earned bipartisan credibility as co-chairs of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, the so-called Simpson-Bowles Commission. I believe the report the commission released in 2010 can still serve as an effective starting point for the public conversation that you are advancing, and I'm grateful for your efforts. Again, thank you so much, Governor Baldacci and Senator Bennett, for your hard work on this critical issue. Senator Simpson-Bowles.
Thanks, Senator. Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Bennett. I've got to run, so I'm going to take this with you.
Please.
Second.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate your kicking off the audience feedback part of the program too, Alex. Thank you very much.
Kick it up for audience feedback.
So we'd be delighted to take your questions and comments. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Senator Bennett. As part of the Bowles-Simpson Commission, it suggests that we scrap the research and development tax credit. We know that of those three items you mentioned, enhancing revenue, cutting spending, and also needing to grow our way, that research and development is a surefire way to grow the economy. Do you think that part of the Bowles-Simpson Commission makes sense to scrap the research and development tax credit when we know so many of our competitors like Japan and South Korea use those kind of mechanisms to grow their economies, and that's why they're ahead in science and technology?
It's a great question, and frankly, I think that this problem is so great that we need to put everything on the table. Now, whether or not that, I won't go through each of the items, but they all have merit. And overall, though, there's a context that, if you begin to just whittle away at each of the elements of, whether it's, people who don't want to reform entitlements, or the people on my side of the aisle that don't want to do anything about taxes or tax reform. I think you begin to unravel the potentiality for doing something here, and we need to do something big, and it needs to be bold. And what the particular elements are, frankly, are not that important. I do think in that context, though, it's really sad that Congress puts itself in a position where to deal with the fiscal cliff, which they pushed from January 1st to now March 1st, that they cannot deal with, for instance, in the Defense Department, the big drivers of expenses are military procurement. It's these weapon systems, frankly, that often Congress people want, the military says they don't need. And you can get into large amounts of money there. But because they put the shackles around their wrists on this particular issue, it means the only way they can hit the targets for sequestration that are coming down the road in just about a week is to cut not military systems, not military bases, not in a thoughtful way. They have to cut people. They have to cut readiness. So, I think the more critical thing from any particular program is commit now to do something big and bold, and then take the time to go through and rationally deal with where do our investments make the most sense.
I apologize again, the phone just doesn't want to see.
You're just a
this
popular guy.
Yeah, well, I was a recovering politician until recently.
Exactly.
Yeah, I fell off the wagon, I think, for retirement. But no, Alex, I think, first of all, I think that research and development is key. Maine doesn't spend enough in research and development. It is a state which qualified for a program which actually was very very aggressive for those states that didn't do well, because without research and development, you're not going to have cutting-edge technologies for your business and industry, and you're not going to be able to stay ahead of the competition, and you're going to fall further behind. There's no question about that. We get a significant amount of resources from Washington. We try to do more at the state level. But I think, as the Senator said, I think you've got to put everything on the table. What, for me, is most basic is that our political leaders lack the maturity and leadership to work together of opposite parties. I was, as I pointed out, when I watched President Clinton work with Newt Gingrich, I mean, when Newt Gingrich was elected Speaker, the first day of that Congress, I went to be interviewed on CBS This Morning with Sonny Bono. Because Sonny ran a Southern California restaurant, we ran one in Maine, and I was a Democrat, he was a Republican, so we were doing this interview, and outside of the green room, we were waiting out there, and then Newt Gingrich was being interviewed. And Newt Gingrich came through the door slamming, swearing, screaming, saying he's never going to be interviewed again because they had shown a tape of Connie Chung being interviewed on 60 Minutes with his mother, who had a cigarette that was dangling ashes, and it was very derogatory towards his mother, and he was very upset, as I would probably be, but my mother doesn't smoke that, or didn't smoke that way, but I can understand. So that was my first day of Congress. I looked at Sonny, I said, this is the first day of Congress. Can you imagine how it's going to get? He's swearing, he's not going to come in here again. But it was a very difficult, we had government shutdowns. He didn't get off the president's plane by the front door, he went out the back door, created a scene. I mean, it was just, it was like an adventure every single week. But during the midst of all of that, my point to you is President Clinton and Speaker Gingrich were able to find some common ground and put forward a balanced plan. And I think that we have got to instill, and that's why I wanted to work with Senate President Bennett, is to demonstrate that the political leaders have to work together. Senator McConnell has got to work with Harry Reid. The President has to work with John Boehner, and they have to learn how to work together, have their differences, and speak about it. I mean, George Mitchell had a wonderful relationship with Bob Dole. They would have ground rules as to how it would be set up and how they would conduct themselves, both on and off the court. They don't do that, and it just seems like it's easier to fight than it is to figure out a way at the end of the day to work together. So rather than get into the particulars of a plan and what those components are, my push is to get them to sit down at the same table and start to work together, because today it's going to be debt and deficit, which I think are very important issues, but tomorrow it could be something else somewhere else. But if they don't have the kind of ability to reach out, and as Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan used to do, then we are going to lose out. Our system is set up to not create laws. It's a check and balance on each other. And I think we've taken it to perfection. You know, and we've got to understand that with those responsibilities came a right to be able to make sure that you move the country ahead at the end of the day. So that's where I'm coming from. So I think research is important. It's something that, you know, we need a lot of, but at the same time, you know, so do we need student loans, so do we need Medicare and Medicaid and prescription drugs, and at the same time tax reform. I mean, we got to look at tax revenues, we got to look at all of it. And if they're willing to look at all of it and work together, then at the end of when they finish, then there's not going to be political gotcha, so that the Republicans won't get burned by doing stuff and slowing down the rate of growth of Social Security and Medicare, because the Democrats work with them on it. What are those elements that we can work on together? Can we change the fee-for-service in Medicare so it's capitated, like a lot of high-quality firms are doing now? Now we pay for each of the services, and the medical community gives us more and more services, they get more and more money. Maybe if we focus on wellness and the patient satisfaction and other elements, and do like Kaiser or Geisinger or Mayo and the way they set up the care, which the patient's bottom line is theirs. There are things we can do differently in prescription drugs. You know, there's no reason why we're paying the rates that we're paying versus the same. So there's a lot of that which will not directly be negative towards people who are receiving benefits, but they're going to have to understand we're going to change the way we're doing things. So, I mean, those are just a little glimpse of the way I see things. So, sorry to be a little bit longer than I anticipated.
Other comments, questions, yes?
Yes. What's the difference between when Clinton and Newt Gingrich came together compared to now? I mean, I know looking at that's a real idea.
Well, I think we were like, it was 16 trillion now, it's like 16.3 trillion now, and it was like 4 or 5 trillion back then.
I meant more towards the political.
The political?
You're you could answer this best, you were there.
Yeah, no, I think, it was a government, I mean, they were writing stories about how it had been the worst time in the country's history, and then Charles Dickens had written a piece in the 1830s, and Charles Dickens, for writing back to England, saying basically that we were not going to be able to last that long as a democracy, and we're ultimately going to be a failure, because when he went to the Congress, they would be coming in with hunting rifles and dogs, and they'd have the spittoons, and they were chewing tobacco and spitting on the floor, and it was just it was an atmosphere which he felt was not conducive, and we'd be actually settling disputes back then by having duels. Maine actually lost
That's what happens when you don't have
in a
women
duel.
in your
They just
Congress.
went out and shot each other, okay? So he's saying, so when he wrote that piece, the Congressional Research Service says, so you think it's bad now, look at back then. So in today, what really bothers me today is that there's no room for, everybody's saying everything out in public, and they get their positions in cement. And I think that's different than it was back then in the days that I worked. You keep your cards close to your vest. You don't start making proclamation out into the public forum, because you have to live by those words, and you don't want to eat those words later on. So I think there's a lot more television, there's a lot more YouTube, and there's a lot more discussion that's out there that's hard to bring back in. And the only way that people are going to work together and not get into the gotcha politics is they have to keep their cards closer to the vest, and they have to keep their conversations off the record, which is unfortunate for the public in terms of public view and transparency. But in terms of being effective and getting the job done, I don't think it's going to, that's the big difference today versus back then.
I have to say, just to add to that, there's just a lack of deliberation. So, one of the reasons that Olympia Snow was so widely respected, as has traditionally been the case with the senators that we've sent to Washington, is that they are always a voice of just, let me think about this, And Maine people respect that. When you say, I'm not going to react right now to this. We've got a little bit of time. Let me think it through. Let me ask the questions. Let me hold the hearings. Let me hear the input. Particularly, let me hear the input about its effect on real people before we just have an ideologically based reaction to some idea, some new idea. And I think that's the real problem, is that people feel like, for whatever reason, whether it's they just have to get out in the news cycle or whatever it is, in the next nanosecond, it's that people just don't deliver.